Okay, this lecture is going to be on the First World War and really the beginning of industrial war and the effects, the ramifications for global ramifications for the 20th century. We're leading at the end of the First World War, we're leading up into the 1920s, 30s, the Second World War, which we'll discuss next week. Okay, I'd like to start out by just providing an example of just how relevant the First World War is to the development of the world that we live in. One thing that is important to point out is that this is the beginning of the end for large-scale European empire building throughout much of the world. You have nations like Britain, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Spain, Portugal. They have created these massive empires throughout much of the world because of the carnage of the First World War, its psychological and cultural aftershocks, and much of the loss of manpower, much of the massive expenditure of wealth. Many of these states and societies will be so weakened that they will begin to retract in terms of their the amount of global influence and imperial power they once possessed, relative to that they once possessed. So this whole process that we've been looking at over the course of the last few weeks, we divide history into before 1500, after 1500 divisions. In the era of the 16th century, we're generally talking about connectivity throughout the entire globe, the Americas, Australia, Asia, Africa, and Europe being connected in a way that has never before happened, and the beginnings of the development of a global economy, something we're still dealing with the repercussions of today. At the same time, we're also looking at a period in which European societies are militarily, economically, culturally, technologically, scientifically, increasingly dominant on a global scale. Well, 1914, as stated earlier regarding these empires, this will be the beginning of a transition towards a much more multipolar world, one in which many regions outside of Europe, in Asia, Africa, the Americas, people began to strive for, in the case of colonies, independence. In the case of some other societies, such as the United States, hegemony, global military and economic power. But I'd like to take a couple of minutes to address an issue that's much closer to home, and that is it has to do with the family. It has to do with cultural ideas about masculinity. So I have before us here two images of family life. One is from the United States, one is from Great Britain. One is a portrait, another is an advertisement. That the fact not really relevant for our discussion right now. But these are both idealized images, and of course idealized imagery exists in all societies at all periods of time in some kind of form or fashion. But nevertheless, they reflected the value system of Europe and the United States at the time, particularly as regarding the structure of the family. So I'd like for you to take just a second to observe this and think about the position of the father of the family relative to the mother, the children, etc. His degree of involvement, his physical proximity, etc. If we switch to some other images in the same vein,
we can see that some patterns tend to emerge. The main one we're going to focus on is the fact that there is a great amount of physical proximity between the kind of patriarchs of the family, the men of the family, and their children. And you can see it reflected in these images as well. And what this is meant to do is it's meant to kind of imply a very subtle, it's a subtle implication, but it's one that's very important for people in this period of time, an amount of kind of fatherly affection from the men in these families towards their children, their wives and their children. It's meant to convey this image in which, despite the fact that this is an era where people's lives are, I think, in many ways, objectively, from my point of view at least, I think objectively, very much harder than many of our lives today in terms of having to deal with diseases that we don't have to struggle from today. And of course, this is before widespread electricity, etc. Right? The comforts of life, many of the creature comforts we take for granted, and many of the life-saving aspects of modern life weren't present. You had high infant mortality, much lower life expectancy, etc. But there's an attempt to, even in this age in which people are in a sense much more hardened by life than in our era, there's an attempt to convey this environment of warmth. That underneath this surface, behind closed doors, there's a great amount of warmth between the members of these families. That these men have a great amount of affection towards their children, towards their wives, and vice versa. That the family unit is very strong. You can see in this advertisement here to the right, one of a type of image that was used in advertisements and in newspapers throughout the United States and Great Britain to sell products. And again, this is an idealized image, but it's important because it tells us what people at the time valued. So you have this image of a father here in candlelight reading the Bible to different members of his family, and what looks like an adult son and his wife with possibly a granddaughter there in the chair. And again, this is an image that's meant to convey something that many people would have identified with, right? A very close-knit family unit, in spite of the travails experienced in the outside world and outside society. And my point with this is that with Victorian masculinity, the 19th century, you had a clear division between your life in your home and your life on the outside. The outside world of work, of business, could be very trying, could be very psychologically difficult, but inside the home, and then we're talking about in an idealized sense here, what people's ideals were, rather than, in many instances, the reality. That's true in any age in terms of ideals and reality often not coming together perfectly. But the family unit was supposed to be very strong. It was supposed to be very healthy, nurturing, with a great amount of love and physical affection. And again, you can see in this cover of this book, this painting, demonstrating this point. The father of the family here is a British soldier, and some of his children are kind of imitating his line of work, much to his amusement. If we fast forward about 80 years or so, all the way to the 1950s here, and you've got this neat little eye moving. I just included that for fun of it. But take a second and look at again at the spacing, where everyone is located, and how people are relative to one another in these two ads. Have another example here of an ad, and also one of a family portrait. And again, take note of the locations of the different members of the family relative to the others. And again, we see a couple of other examples of what we've been talking about so far. This change in the family dynamic as presented in advertisements, idealized images, etc. And certainly, again, we're looking at idealized imagery, but that idealized imagery is important for telling us what people valued. And when we look at this picture on the right and we see the uniformed father, that's significant for where we're going with this discussion. And you can see it reflected in these images as well. And what this is meant to do is it's meant to kind of imply a very subtle, it's a subtle implication, but it's one that's very important for people in this period of time, an amount of kind of fatherly affection from the men in these families towards their children, their wives and their children. It's meant to convey this image in which, despite the fact that this is an era where people's lives are, I think, in many ways, objectively, from my point of view at least, I think objectively, very much harder than many of our lives today in terms of having to deal with diseases that we don't have to struggle from today. And of course, this is before widespread electricity, etc. Right? The comforts of life, many of the creature comforts we take for granted, and many of the life-saving aspects of modern life weren't present. You had high infant mortality, much lower life expectancy, etc. This is also a period in which idealized forms of masculinity began to develop in the rise of superheroes. This is the period in which American superheroes first began to take off. And we can see an example of Superman here swimming towards a German U-boat which has sunk an American ship. Again, this is an idealized image, but it's a sign of kind of a changing mentality. The generations enduring the first half of the 20th century are under a great amount of duress. They're having to adapt to very precarious international circumstances. And both 1917, 1941, the United States, a generation of young men are having to adapt to military service throughout the world. A generation of young women are having to adapt to working in an industrialized environment for the first time in many instances, though not in all, but having to adapt to very intense war production. And really the social organization, a society organized around warfare. And you can see this, and this is reflected in this change in attitudes about masculinity, about the role of men in society. You can see that in the hairstyles as reflected by presidents. If you look at Rutherford B. Hayes, you look at Grover Cleveland, Ulysses S. Grant, even though Ulysses S. Grant was a soldier, you see a 19th century conception of hair, of facial hair, and the type of haircut that took off in the First World War, based on a clean-shaven man with short hair or a shaved head. This was experimented. This was an experimental form of military hairstyle. In the trenches, this type of hairstyle was considered more sanitary, prevented disease from breaking out in the minds of military planners. And then once that began to, once the hairstyle began to be adopted, military planners began to notice that there was the effect of uniformity, that it served to uh, to promote unit cohesion. So you see this reduction in the amount of hair men wore as a reflection of their time in these military units, to the point to where in the 1950s you have young men who are civilians walking around with crew cuts, which could easily be on infantry and military bases throughout the world. I'll just give this example here. You can see this guy here standing up. That's my grandfather. You can see by his body language, by how he carries himself. He's very confident. He's very tough, very stoic. This is a picture taken of him and a friend of his before he parachuted into France during the Normandy invasion in 1944. A very harrowing experience in which he was put under a great amount of stress and duress. He was in he previously had been in battles in North Africa and the invasion of Sicily. He would later be in the Battle of the Bulge and in the most harrowing experience of his life, as he described to me just before he died, which was the liberation of the concentration camp of Dachau, one of the few actual death camps liberated by American forces on the ground. And that experience changed. He had told his children, he had 6 children, they knew very little about his military service, and of course it was a touchy subject, so they never asked. And when I was younger, I wanted to know, I wanted to find out, and it turns out he was highly decorated. He won the Bronze Star. He had been in the 101st Airborne Division. He had been on the front lines in most of the major engagements on the Western Front in Europe in World War II, and including the Battle of the Bulge and the liberation of Dachau, as I previously mentioned. But he had never told anyone about that. And the reason that I think that that's so significant is that that reflects what I've been really trying to get at with this discussion, which is that these nations in Europe and North America and Asia, they called on the young men of these generations to make enormous sacrifices, and not just the physical sacrifices of life and limb. There are psychological costs to going through these experiences. Before he died, he told me about an experience in which he had to move from one area to another, a pile of children under 5 years of age, basically a giant pile of corpses of children under 5 years of age. Now, to endure something like that, there's a psychological cost. You cannot come away from something like that unscathed, and it was clear that he hadn't come away unscathed. And part of that cost was borne by his wife and his children, because while he was not an abusive man, he was a very hard drinker. But while that might seem like a huge problem, the real problem was that he was a workaholic. Like so many men of his generation, he had grown up in the Depression, and to top that off, he had come of age being shot at by the elite of SS in the Western Front, and there was a story he told me where they were going through Austria, where the remnants of the SS were held up after the fall of Berlin, and a German soldier dropped down from a tree attached to a parachute harness, and he had a machine gun, the kind of machine gun that would be mounted on a vehicle, but because he was suspended in midair, he was able to fire it, but he was firing it wildly. My grandfather kind of outflanked him and got in close range and shot him in the groin, and it went all the way through him. And then after they had cut the cadaver down, the boy he was 16 years old. And that's just another experience that he had kept from his immediate family all the way until right before his death, and telling me about it. And as I said, he was a workaholic. He would get up at 4:30 in the morning. He was a cattle farmer and a carpenter, and he would work until 6:30 that evening. And then he would go in and he would eat his dinner, and then he would shower, and he would, when he was older, he still worked, but he would watch wrestling sometimes in the middle of the day. Memphis wrestling would come on, and he followed that. Jerry Lawler and all of those guys. But there was a psychological toll that had to be paid, and his children paid that toll because he was very distant from them. He didn't interact with them. He didn't teach them, and I think that they also suffered that damage, and then their children suffered that damage. One of my cousins right now is incarcerated for assault with a deadly weapon, and there are numerous problems that are coming out of really in our whole family. And again, there are a number of reasons for that, but this is something that has affected our entire society, because never before in the history of the human race, before the 20th century, did we have an entire generation of young people so profoundly affected by warfare. Even in societies like, for example, the various indigenous nations in the Americas who were wiped out, they were wiped out over a relatively long period of time. Even with the Aztecs, you were looking at deaths primarily due to disease. And on top of that, the conditions were different. Men sitting in a trench for 9-10 months at a time under constant artillery bombardment, with scenes of carnage that are really unprecedented. This is something that was very difficult for people to come to grips with. And when you take into account the values of this generation, of both of these generations, the kind of enforced stoicism, the whole, I'm not going to whine about anything. I don't want to be seen as a whiner. I'm going to take all this upon myself and keep it locked away. It's something that has affected how people were raised, and how they raised their children, and really it has had an effect on the direction of our society. If you take, for example, if you've ever seen a movie or the show Mad Men, this Don Draper and all the characters, there will be kids. If you ever see an episode where their kids are around, they don't pay their kids much attention. The kids kind of go out and do their own thing, it's very different from the kind of overbearing styles of parenting that many people criticize today. And this, some psychologists have argued that it's due to the fact that, that many of these men they had to bury many of their emotions, and in order to bury many of the bad ones, they had to bury many of the good ones as well. But take of that what you will. I just wanted to discuss this to kind of point out that we're dealing with, in the First World War, the beginning of this period of massive kind of civilization-wide trauma throughout the globe. And previously in warfare, in the Middle Ages, in the early modern period, you would have what they call the campaign season. So basically in late spring to summer, the crops would have been planted. You would then call up those men who were eligible to serve, and they would be outfitted, and then you would fight throughout the summer. And then in autumn, mid to late autumn, when it was time to harvest the crops, the wars would end, people would go home, and they would harvest their crops and resume the agricultural cycle. And of course, with the weaponry in the Middle Ages, the casualties were relatively low, looking at 1 to 2% of armies perishing, right? Whereas in World War I, we're looking at 40% of those under arms being killed, in some instances in some regions of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, for example. Huge numbers, 37 million deaths. So the lethality of warfare increased dramatically. All right, the political background to the First World War. We can't talk about the First World War without talking about this guy pictured here, Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck was a statesman responsible for the unification of Germany. He was loyal to a state called Prussia, which is kind of an East German state. The King of Prussia, Bismarck, had basically wielded a unified state out of the many different independent states within Germany, and made the King of Prussia the Kaiser, the German for Caesar, basically the emperor of a unified German empire. The way that Bismarck did this, you have dozens of independent German states. Many of them don't like one another. Many of them have different political agendas. He managed to unify them due to their hostility to a common enemy, and that was Napoleon III, the Emperor of France. Napoleon III had been fearful of the unification of Germany, and Bismarck used Napoleon III as kind of a tool for bringing the different German states together. He produced a fake telegram, which insulted Napoleon III, sending the telegram to the King of Prussia. Napoleon III found out about it, which was by Bismarck's design. Bismarck intentionally leaked it, and Napoleon III, whose numbers were, the people were kind of turning against him in Paris and other key areas of France, so he wanted to fight a war to kind of shore up his support. And he believed that the Germans, particularly the Prussians at the time, that the many different German states would kind of waver in their support for Prussia, that the German military would be very easily swept from the field. But Bismarck knew better. The Prussian army had been reformed very effectively in the 19th century by Bismarck. The Prussian army was based on platoons, companies, and for the first time, this idea of squads, platoons, companies, basically the modern American army structure. In most countries throughout the world, the modern structure of the army is based on this 19th century German and 20th century German adaptations, the Germans being very effective, very important in terms of military innovation. But the different German states backed Prussia out of their animosity towards Napoleon III and the French nation, and their military made very short work of the French army, defeating it utterly. And at the Battle of Sedan, Bismarck, the Prussian military captured Napoleon III, and their victory was assured after that. After Napoleon III was deposed, the new government, the people deposed Napoleon III after his defeat. Socialists in Paris seceded from the rest of the country and established what's called the Paris Commune. So this is basically the equivalent of New York City rebelling against the United States and trying to establish its own nation. France also had to cede territories of Alsace-Lorraine to Prussia. So Bismarck and Prussia were so prestigious at the end of this war that all of the different German states fell in line and consented to the unification of Germany under Prussian leadership. So, if you look in the center of this map, where there was once dozens of little states, there is now this huge unified empire. and it was very, very threatening to Russia, Britain, and France, particularly France, who had already lost territory to the Germans. The French would be hungry for revenge in the succeeding decades, or at least the French leadership, and suddenly this new state, rising state, altered the balance of power. Bismarck allied Germany with an empire called Austria-Hungary, and this is an empire, you can see it here, it's southeast of Germany, and on this map, it was dominated by Austrians, German-speaking people from Austria, right? And the Austrians were the elites, the Austrian Habsburgs were the royal family, the nobility, but they ruled many diverse peoples, Croats, Serbs, Bosnians, etc., Hungarians. And so they had this very diverse empire where there were Orthodox Christians, Catholic Christians, Protestant Christians of different traditions, Muslims, and Jews. And in addition to there being these many different ethnic groups. And in this period of time, many of these different ethnic groups believed that they should have their own national states, that they should have independence from Austro-Hungarian control, that the empire was oppressive, that it was forcibly holding all these diverse people together when they should be allowed to form their own states. And so the Austro-Hungarian Empire was very, very insecure. The leadership was fearful of these nationalist movements and was always on edge against threats to its territorial sovereignty, particularly from Russia. The Russians had supported the Serbs who had broken away from Austria-Hungary. There were parts of Serbia still under Austro-Hungarian control, and the Russians also advocated for those territories to become independent. This made the Austrians very, very wary of Russia, and now that this new unified German state has emerged in the center of Europe, it made them, they were kind of natural allies. But Bismarck had drafted a treaty with the Russian Tsar preventing conflict. That way, if the French decided that they wanted revenge to attack Germany from the west, Germany would not have to fight a two-front war. The Russians had agreed not to intervene. But the Kaiser's successor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, successor of Kaiser Wilhelm I, thought he knew better than Bismarck, so he dismissed the Chancellor when he took power, and he allowed this treaty to lapse. So what that meant was that when the First World War broke out, the Germans would have to fight a two-front war. That's be very important for later. Germany was not the only Central European nation that had undergone a process of unification in the 19th century. The second major newly unified nation was Italy. Italy had consisted of dozens of city-states. Eventually, a kind of nationalist hero named Giuseppe Garibaldi had waged a guerrilla war against the different Italian city-states, bringing these city-states together under one monarchy. Germany and Italy, because they had unified so late historically, they lacked overseas colonies. Throughout the 19th century, if you remember the idea of the scramble for Africa, the British and French are gobbling up these different colonies in Asia and Africa, and there's very little territory for the Germans and Italians to take by the time they undergo the process of unification and have the ability to take those territories. And if you remember, Liberia and Ethiopia are the only two independent states in Africa by this period. So the Italians, who wanted an empire in Africa, had a choice. They could attack Liberia, which would bring down the wrath of the United States, or they could attack Ethiopia. And Ethiopia would be diplomatically difficult to attack due to the fact that it had a Christian monarchy, and the Ethiopian royal family, the Solomonid dynasty, the descendants of Solomon, according to Ethiopian tradition. David's son Solomon with the Queen of Sheba. The Menelik the first was the son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, according to Ethiopian tradition. That dynasty was very popular throughout Europe, especially among European royalty, who were kind of fascinated by this ancient African civilization and monarchy with the ancient form of Christianity. So it would be very difficult diplomatically for the Italians to pull that off, but they attempted it. Under the leadership of Menelik II, the emperor pictured here, and pictured here in his full regal attire, the Ethiopians handily defeated the Italian military. And this is partially due to the fact that Russia, also being Orthodox Christians, again, remember Russia supporting Serbia and different territories within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Russians funneled rifles and other weapons into Ethiopia. But even with that support, the Ethiopians were grossly outnumbered, grossly outgunned, and it was primarily due to Menelik and the kind of resolve of the Ethiopian monarchy and the Ethiopian nobility and people in resisting this invasion. And this defeat completely humiliated the Italian leadership. This had made the newly unified nation of Ethiopia kind of the laughingstock in the courts of Europe, because they had been defeated by this, what was considered kind of a very weak, kind of backwards nation. And the Italians, humiliated, wanted revenge. And so they sought out new alliances to try to strengthen themselves in the wake of this defeat. Okay. So you have the newly unified nations, Germany and Italy, right in the center of Europe. They're hungry for colonies. There aren't very many territories left to colonize due to the massive presence of the British and French empires in Africa and Asia. The Germans managed to take southwestern Africa, what's now Namibia, and some islands in the Pacific, but they were not unified quickly enough to gain access to large chunks of territory. With that said, the Germans had developed a very efficient, very large, very well-trained, very well-supplied, well-equipped army. So the Germans, hungry for establishing an empire and becoming a great nation, were primed to take colonies away from either Britain or France. And the British and French were very, very hesitant to lose territory to the Germans, to the Italians, to any newcomers. In fact, they wanted to maintain their imperial control. The British in India, South and East Africa, the French in West Africa, and Indochina, what's now Vietnam. They wanted to maintain this control at all costs. So they had to find a way to secure these overseas territories from possible German aggression. And the solution was the so-called alliance system. It's one in which the old powers in Europe allied together to kind of prevent the new powers from muscling their way into their colonies in Africa and Asia. And of course the new powers allied together to overthrow the old powers. You can see in this image here of France, Russia, and Great Britain. France on the left, La Marie. In the center you have Russia holding up the Orthodox cross. It's got the little diagonal slant on the bottom. And to the right you can see Great Britain, the woman holding the anchor, symbolizing the British Navy, the most powerful navy in the world at the time. Up until the end of the Second World War, it would remain the most powerful navy in the world. So the end result is that the European continent is divided into two armed camps of imperial powers. And because all of these states were allied with one another, it's like filling a room filled with gunpowder and gasoline. The slightest spark could cause the whole thing to go up in flames. Of course, this is what happened. If any one little nation was attacked, that meant that the entire continent would be dragged into the conflict due to these alliances. When George Washington talked about entangling alliances, this is a prime example of entangling alliances. Alliances that you can't get out of, that lead to unforeseen consequences beyond their initial purpose. One camp was called the Triple Entente. This was the UK, France, and Russia. The UK in 1915 was the world's richest nation. It had only recently, a generation before, overcame China as the largest GDP on Earth due to its massive industrialization. The United Kingdom was the first nation to completely industrialize. And in 1914, it was the largest naval power on Earth, with the largest global empire on Earth. The statement was, the sun never sets on the British Empire, meaning that the British Empire was so large and it spanned so much of the world that somewhere in the British Empire it was always daylight. And on top of that, the British Empire is the largest empire in the history of the world in terms of landmass, due to its inclusion of India, large chunks of Africa, Australia, Canada, etc. France was a very formidable ally for the United Kingdom. It had a large population, it had a large, well-equipped, well-trained army. The French also possessed a large colonial empire, and they were eager to avenge themselves, at least the French leadership, upon Germany. And to the east, you have the state of Russia. Russia was technologically backwards. The feudalism had only been abolished a generation before, well, 2 generations before. But it was it was not industrialized significantly. It was technologically lagging. At the same time, the population of Russia was very large, and the Russians could field a very large army as a result. So what they lacked in technology, they made up for in numbers. The opponents of the Triple Entente were the Triple Alliance. And the primary player, that just as the UK was kind of the primary player of the Triple Entente, the primary player of the Triple Alliance was Germany. Germany, again, had only recently been unified, and it lacked overseas possessions. Also, we have Italy, and again, Italy had only recently been unified, it lacked overseas possessions. And finally, Austria-Hungary. It also lacked overseas possessions. It itself was this huge, very diverse empire that was threatened with unraveling at any time due to the massive amount of racial and religious tensions inside the empire. So you have these states without empires banding together, just as you have states with empires banding together. One wants to maintain the status quo, one wants to overturn the status quo and become new imperial powers. And again, I use the analogy of filling a room full of gunpowder and then lighting a match. That match would be the assassination of the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary. And his name was Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He was the second in line for the first in line rather, for the throne of Austria-Hungary. This is the equivalent of the vice president of the United States. And he was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip. Now, Serbia was an independent nation at the time, but a chunk of Serbia was still in the possession of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so inside Serbia proper, the independent portion of Serbia, one of the world's first terrorist organizations was formed. It was called the Black Hand, and it was a group of Serbian nationalists who, through espionage, through sabotage, wanted to reunite the independent part of Serbia with the part still under the control of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And a member of the Black Hand, a man named Gabriel Princip, assassinated the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and killed him, he and his wife, after he rolled a grenade underneath their car in the city of Sarajevo while the Archduke and his wife were touring the city of Sarajevo. He rolled a grenade underneath the car. It didn't go off. He rushed the car and he gunned them both down. After this, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. A member of their royal family had been killed by a terrorist trained in Serbia. They declared war. The problem is that, again, we have the system of kind of entangling alliances. Well, Russia was an ally of Serbia. So Russia declared war on Austria-Hungary. And, of course, who's Austria-Hungary allied to? Germany. So Germany declared war on Russia. And who's Russia allied to? France. And the British were hesitant to honor their alliance with France and Russia at first, but when German troops marched through neutral Belgium to attack France, Great Britain declared war on Germany. So the entirety of Europe is being soaked up in this conflict. The Ottoman Empire, which had lost much of its territory to Russia in the previous century, decided to ally with Germany against Russia in the hopes of getting this territory back. Eventually, due to unrestricted submarine warfare, the German Navy was blockaded by the German nation was blockaded by Great Britain. Great Britain having this massive surface fleet, the German Navy turned to submarines in order to break this blockade. And this was a technique that was originally pioneered by the Confederacy in the American Civil War. The Union Navy blockaded the southern United States, and the Confederate Navy they developed a submarine in order to try to break this blockade. Well, the Germans revived that technique because they also were being blockaded. So, but they were able to make much more effective submarines, U-boats. Eventually, they engaged in what's called unrestricted submarine warfare, where the submarines shoot at any ships that come within range of supplying or traveling to and from Great Britain. And a ship was sunk with a large number of Americans on board. So this angered the American public, which had remained neutral throughout the first 2 years of the war. Finally, the last straw was something called the Zimmermann Telegraph. And the Zimmermann Telegraph, if you remember from your U.S. history, in the 1840s, the United States went to war with Mexico. It annexed Texas, and it gained California, New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona, Colorado from the treaty with Mexico. Well, less than 80 years later, again, these states, Mexico had lost these territories. It wasn't inconceivable in 1914 for the Mexican government to want these territories back. Some areas, particularly of Arizona and New Mexico, were still very sparsely settled. But the German foreign minister, Zimmermann, sent a telegraph to the president of Mexico, and he said, if the United States declares war on us, if you enter the war on our side, and you tie the American troops down on your border with the United States, after we defeat France and Britain, we will send our troops to Mexico, and we will help you get all these areas back: Texas, California, New Mexico, Nevada, etc. And this outraged the American public. And after this point, the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, the climate was one was pro-war against the Central Powers, against Germany. So what exactly made the fighting in the First World War so bloody and so important culturally? Well, for one thing, it's the second large-scale industrial war, total war, in history, the first being the American Civil War. And like the American Civil War, it was a massive bloodletting. But unlike the American Civil War, whereas in conflict between the United States and Confederate States, you had rifled muskets,
rifled artillery making its appearance, the machine gun making its appearance with the Gatling gun, with the submarine and the ironclad warship, and trench warfare, the very first instance of trench warfare, modern trench warfare in the history of the world, which was at the siege of Petersburg on the Eastern Theater, when Robert E. Lee attempted to halt the advance of the Union forces into Virginia towards Richmond. But what made the First World War, we're looking at an even more extreme situation, because as the American Civil War progressed, these weapons were introduced piecemeal and in kind of a primitive fashion. For example, the early Gatling gun was nothing like the Browning machine gun in 1916 that you see these two British soldiers with gas masks on firing. These weapons, rifled howitzers, machine guns, later on tanks, poison, chlorine and cyanide gases, aircraft. The aircraft invented in 1903 was used at first for reconnaissance in the First World War, and then after it was used for reconnaissance, you start to have dogfights between these two different reconnaissance teams of reconnaissance aircraft trying to scout out the battlefield below, and eventually they're actually dropping munitions on the enemy. The Germans used Zeppelins in an attempt to drop bombs on the English population to terrorize them into surrendering, and the Germans used poison gas in an attempt to surprise the British troops and French troops. But these trenches, a network of trenches stretching from Switzerland to the North Sea, basically the entire length of the western border of the state of Illinois, massive basically entire towns submerged in these trenches. You have two sides lining up against one another. They each have backup trenches in case one of the forward trench positions falls. The trenches are filled with machine gun nests. They're filled with soldiers. There's massive amounts of barbed wire. Again, an invention developed first used at the siege of Petersburg, these trenches are extremely difficult to take. The way that the trench warfare was organized is that, let's say you have the Germans in one trench, the British and French in another. Well, the Germans want to assault the British and French positions. So for a period of 30 days, they may pound the British and French positions with artillery. Massive pounding. We're talking about howitzers going off every couple of minutes, launching huge incendiary shells that, the soldiers who are on guard at the top of the trench are being hit with shrapnel. The soldiers who are underneath in the barracks trying to cook some soup, the bowl of soup is rattling on the table. There's no psychological peace. This is going on for 30 days straight, this massive shelling. And then when the enemy is supposedly softened up, then the Germans will send out what they call stormtroopers, which are elite soldiers trained to cut barbed wire to move across what's called no man's land, which is the land in between the two trenches. This dangerous land pounded into oblivion by artillery, huge craters, no grass, looking like the surface of the moon. There are dead bodies and body parts lying in these craters, filling up with water, rats eating human flesh, arms, legs. These German stormtroopers make it across. They attempt to cut the British and French barbed wire, trying to dodge machine gun fire. Most of them are killed, but they do enough damage so that the remainder of the German army can go, quote-unquote, over the top. Well, actually, that's a British term, but the term over the top comes from the British in the First World War, that the men would go over the top after the officer blew his whistle. It's the same kind of pattern with the Germans, and they go across no man's land. Huge numbers of them are killed, hit with machine guns, hit with artillery, and if they take the trench, if they get into bloody hand-to-hand combat inside the trench, attacking with shovels, with bayonets, with hand grenades and pistols, and of course their issued rifles, if they make it into the enemy trench, the enemy just falls back to a backup trench. Okay, so this is extremely, extremely bloody. And like with the American Civil War, just as in the first day of the Battle of Shiloh, there were more American casualties than in the War of 1812, the Mexican War, and the Revolutionary War combined. Okay, with this new industrial war, we're looking at insane amounts of casualties. You can take a look at some of these statistics in terms of casualties. There are 3 battles I'd like to point out. One is the Somme. There's a video of some fighting at the Battle of the Somme that I'd like you to take a look at. But we're looking at over 1 million casualties. Okay, most of a majority of them Allied, mostly British, a little less than half a million German. This is extremely bloody. I mean, this is unprecedented in terms of the numbers of deaths in these single battles. On top of that, the battles were seen, they were very futile. For example, Italy, which was originally allied to Germany and Austria-Hungary, the British and French promised Italy that they could get territory from Austria-Hungary if they switched sides. So the Italians did. And at the 11th Battle of the Isonzo, battle number 11 now, in this one mountain pass into Tyrolia, into the Austrian-controlled Alps, you're looking at the Austrians losing 100,000 soldiers, 100,000 casualties, the Italians 150,000, and that's on the last of 11 battles. When we look at a battle, a period of the war seen as kind of a cakewalk, when the United States entered the war, it entered the war with large numbers of fresh troops, expertly trained, with well equipped, ready to, with high morale. The Americans had the sense that they were coming and they were going to clean up the conflict. But in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which the French in particular saw as the lightest fighting in the war since, the Americans just swept through and routed the Germans because the Germans were out of supplies, the morale was low, they had been bled dry in a long war of attrition. The Americans lost 115,000 casualties. Okay, and just for a comparison, we're looking at around 58,000 Americans killed in the Vietnam War, okay, which lasted much longer, and that's a testament to the intensity of this fighting. And this is just in one campaign, not the entire war. The aftermath of the war, we're looking at 37 million people killed. This is an unprecedented number, and it had a huge psychological impact on European civilization. We're looking at entire generations of European young men basically ravaged by this conflict. The nation of Austria-Hungary had obtained so many casualties that essentially that regime was basically bled dry and ultimately just crumbled. The Ottoman Empire, same kind of thing. The Ottoman Emperor, last Ottoman Sultan was the last Ottoman Sultan was overthrown, and a similar thing with the Russian Empire. The Russian Tsar was overthrown by the rising communists, rising Communist Party, partly due to a backlash, due to the sheer number of deaths absorbed by the Russian peasant population, and on top of that, the fact that resources, that food, that fuel, wood, medicine, all of that was in such such short supply. And if you just look at, for example, military deaths in the United Kingdom, we're looking at a little bit short of 1 million. But when you look at the total for the entire British Empire, there's over 1 million. And this is important for later on, because the British were using African soldiers, Indian soldiers, Australian soldiers in particular. The Australians took a huge beating in an offensive called Gallipoli, in which a younger Winston Churchill attempted to break the back of the Ottoman Empire and secure contact with Russia, and the Ottoman troops resisted much more ferociously than the British had thought, and large numbers of Australians were killed. In fact, Anzac Day, Australia and New Zealand, a huge holiday there, kind of the equivalent of the 4th of July in the U.S., is in honor of these soldiers who were killed. And of course, the British Crown, there was controversy that they were using Australian, New Zealander, and Canadian soldiers and South African soldiers basically as cannon fodder, that they were using them as, and same with the Indian soldiers and from other areas, that they were being used to secure, used recklessly. Germany was defeated, and this will have huge implications for the 1930s, because this defeat was very bitter. The Germans lost a lot of their youth. They had made tremendous sacrifices. They had been defeated, and on top of that, the treaty that had been imposed by the French and British, and we'll talk more about this in the next unit, in the 1930s, the Treaty of Versailles was extremely bitter. It was very hard for the Germans to swallow. Finally, the one nation that benefited from this war was the United States. The United States had remained neutral throughout most of the fighting. None of the fighting took place on American soil. The United States had loaned money to Britain and France throughout the course of the war. So, believe it or not, the United States was a creditor nation in 1918 at the end of this war. On top of that, while the British, the Russians, the French, the Germans, they were all kind of seen as kind of getting their hands dirty in this brutal war, the United States, particularly due to President Woodrow Wilson, kind of emerged globally as this very moralistic force. You know, that Woodrow Wilson had argued for self-determination for peoples of Europe, for democracy, for an end to colonialism, and this was very well received by many people around the world, because even in Allied countries, for example, in France and Britain, obviously people saw their own nations as the protagonists, but Wilson and the Americans had a kind of moral strength that many of the European nations seemingly lacked. And this is due to Wilson pushing the war, attempting to sell the war in the United States as a war for democracy. And of course this caught on as many nations emerging from, for example, the Austro-Hungarian Empire were created new democracies at the end of the war. So as I said, there's constant bombardment by howitzers of these soldiers in these trenches as they attempt to move across no man's land in these almost surreal environments. Rain-soaked craters, rats and other vermin in the trenches with soldiers. Disease spread rapidly. The sky was kind of a reddened, gray, ashy color due to all the ash and dust kicked up. There's a significant amount of land in France today that is is non-arable due to the fact that it was pounded into oblivion by howitzers in the First World War, and it has still not recovered. And finally, all of these soldiers in these trenches, these millions of troops, are at a breeding ground for disease. And of course, when they will return to their homes in 1918, they will spread the Spanish flu, which will kill millions of more people throughout the world. And in fact, if you go to a cemetery in St. Louis, anywhere, and you look and you see in 1918, 1919, 1920, you'll see large numbers of children under the age of 12 dying for those years. And that's due to the spread of this flu, which was extremely deadly, and a kind of a secondary outgrowth of this war. And again, the futility. These assaults, quote unquote, over the top, might gain as little as half a mile of territory, even though we're looking at 80,000, 90,000 lives lost. And it's due to the backup trenches. This is due to the slow, grinding nature of this war. As I stated earlier, this war would have an immense cultural impact on European thinking. If you recall this idea of the white man's burden, this idea that European people have not just a justification, but a duty, a moral duty to go around, quote unquote, civilizing different peoples, changing their cultures into cultures based on European models, getting rid of their traditional religious, economic, and political systems, and trying to rebuild them in what the Europeans conceived of as civilized facsimiles, as Europeanized versions. But this idea became much more taboo after the First World War, particularly among the younger generation who had fought in the war. This idea that the British, the French, the Germans, that they have this duty to go around civilizing people. Well, many people began to ask, if we're civilizing these people, just where are we leading them? Are we leading these colonized peoples to a great war? Are we leading them to all of this carnage, all of this savagery and destruction? Is that where we're headed? Are the people in India who we're attempting to anglicize and get to learn English and become Anglican Christians, are we leading them towards sacrificing an entire generation of their own young men in trench warfare? Is that where we're headed? Those kinds of questions began to be asked. And of course, this idea that European civilizations were inherently superior, that they were inherently more civilized, this idea took a serious blow in the wake of this devastating conflict. And again, the United States, which, at least on the surface, Woodrow Wilson had claimed that it was entering the war to make the world safe for democracy. The United States did not possess a large empire, though it did the Hawaiian Islands, Puerto Rico, the Philippine Islands, U.S. Virgin Islands, etc., were possessions of the United States. The United States was not seen as an imperial power in the same way the British, the French, the Germans, the Russians, etc. Were seen. And so the United States was seen as kind of a much more moral world power than some of these other world powers, and thus many people around the world began to put their faith in the United States leadership globally. And we'll see this increase throughout the decades until at the end of the Second World War, where the United States becomes one of the two dominant world leaders, the two dominant superpowers, the other being the Soviet Union. And finally, the British, the French, the Germans, they had armed peoples in their colonies to fight for them. Come and join the British Army, and when you return to India, you will be able to vote, you will have the right of self-determination, you will be able to choose your own form of government, you will be able to choose independence if you so wish. So you have millions of people from the non-European world coming to Europe to fight, fighting in Africa, fighting in Asia, fighting at sea. And of course, when they return to their home countries, They say, well, what about that promise that you made for us to have the franchise, for us to have a more self-rule? And of course, in many instances, these promises were retracted. At the same time, a movement began to grow in many countries, for example, such as India, in which clamoring for independence began to become louder and louder and louder. And again, the moral example set by Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, etc., of European superiority and imperialism, that lost a lot of moral credibility, and that only strengthened these independence movements in many parts of the world. And of course, the United States gained politically from that, because the United States was seen as the quintessential post-colonial society at the time. The United States had been a colony, it had gained independence, and many societies looked to the United States for guidance in that sense. If you take a look at this painting, The Gassed, you can see the sentiment of the war encapsulated by this artist. The devastation of these men who have been blinded by poison gas, being led with one hand in front of the man in front of them. This would have a huge psychological impact on these men, some of whom permanently lost their sight. One German soldier who, well, technically he was Austrian, but he was fighting for the German army. One soldier who lost his sight temporarily and recovered it was Adolf Hitler. Right? And like so many German and Austrian young men of that generation, this war changed his mentality, and it affected him throughout the entirety of his life, the entirety of his regime in Germany, throughout the entirety of the Second World War. So this is a total war, like the American Civil War. It's a war in which each side is trying to totally destroy one another and is willing to make any sacrifice necessary to obtain victory. So that includes conscription. For example, the Confederate States were one of the first nations to adopt a very intrusive national conscription policy. There had been, in Revolutionary France, there had been a conscription policy. But again, you see the Confederacy imposing. That's one of the problems the Confederacy had, is the Confederacy had propped itself up on this idea of strict of the rights of states to determine their own destiny, and yet the central government of the Confederacy had no choice but to enact what was seen by, for example, the Confederate Vice President Alexander Hamilton Stevens as draconian measures, a draft, and invasive taxes. But this was par for the course for the belligerent powers of the First World War. Millions of men put into uniforms, millions of women put to work in the home front, rationing of supplies, people growing victory gardens to eat vegetables or to provide vegetables for the troops. This touched every aspect of life. This was not a war in which the great majority of people were untouched. This is the beginning. This is the first instance of what we would call a generation gap. This is the first instance in which the term is used, and it's used in Great Britain to describe the differences between the generation that fought this war and the generation and their parents' generation. You had millions of veterans returning home. Some of them were psychologically and physically scarred. Some of them were maimed. They're coming back traumatized from this intense conflict, rain, the ash, the smoke, the trench, 11 months of constant artillery pounding, being shell-shocked. If you look at the video of the shell-shock victim and his treatment and recovery that I included in this description box, you can. The reason that they use this term shell-shocked is that with the constant pounding of artillery, the constant rattling of cups in the mess hall, the constant shaking of bunks in the barracks underneath inside the trenches, the constant flattening of the ground, the dust being kicked up. This had an effect on people's nervous system because, you know, artillery is coming in. You're going to want to hit the deck, but you can't hit the deck every 2 seconds for 9 months, right? So, you know, this has an intense, it changes people neurologically. And, you know, many of these young men were coming back to Britain, France, Germany, after having experienced this. And, of course, their parents' generation still had kind of a 19th century concept of war, that it was very noble, that it was very romantic. In the 19th century, you have these colonial wars in which very small numbers of people are killed, and if they're killed, they kind of die gallantly, not in these feudal ways that happened in the First World War. The poet here that we're looking at, Siegfried Sassoon, kind of one of the first young men to come back and really express his sentiments regarding this generation gap, these values that he has relative to his parents' generation, having been psychologically traumatized from this event. You know, he describes people dying anonymously, being blown to bits, being hit by artillery, nothing heroic about it, arms blown off, legs blown off. It's far from, for example, Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade, where you have these, you know, dashing dragoons riding forth toward charging the Russian artillery, right? These are people living and dying in filth, anonymously, without any kind of glory. So I'd like for you to take a second to listen to the poem Aftermath. Okay, this poem Aftermath is a perfect example of kind of the survivor's guilt that was felt by many of those who returned from the trenches in 1918. Guys like Siegfried Sassoon, unable to reconcile their new lives as citizens, as living a civilian life of relative comfort and ease, with the destruction and carnage they experienced in the trenches. There's also a poem called The Hero, and I'd like for you to listen to this poem now and compare the attitude of the mother who has lost her son in the war, who has attempted to reconcile her suffering by holding to what Siegfried Sassoon calls gallant lies, these romantic notions of war, the older generation's idea of war, of pre-industrial war, that's very romantic and very personal, with the soldier informing her with his view of war and how he notes how her son had attempted to get sent home, how he had suffered psychologically, and finally how he had just been blown to smithereens by an artillery shell. So just compare that, and compare these two generations and their opinions about warfare and their experiences. So, this younger generation is forever changed by this event. What this means is that these industrial societies are now in the age of industrial warfare. They can never go back to sabers and horses and these gallant knights and men-at-arms up there proving their mettle, picking out an opponent amongst the enemy and going at it. That's not how warfare is ever going to be for the rest of the 20th century. It's going to be industrialized. It's going to involve artillery. Increasingly, it's going to involve tanks, poison gas, eventually strategic bombing and the flattening of cities, and finally, the nuclear era will be opened up by the atomic bombing of 2 cities in Japan when we talk about the end of the Second World War. And Sassoon is grieving over this changed reality. You can take a look at some of these statistics in terms of casualties. There are 3 battles I'd like to point out. One is the Somme. And there's a video of some fighting at the Battle of the Somme that I'd like you to take a look at. But we're looking at over 1 million casualties. Okay, most of a majority of them Allied, mostly British, a little less than 500,000 German. This is extremely bloody. I mean, this is unprecedented in terms of the numbers of deaths in these single battles. On top of that, the battles were seen, they were very futile. For example, Italy, which was originally allied to Germany and Austria-Hungary, the British and French promised Italy that they could get territory from Austria-Hungary if they switched sides. So the Italians did. And at the 11th Battle of the Isonzo, at battle number 11 now. Also, and this is the last element of this discussion of the First World War. In the 18th and 19th centuries, if we were to talk about American culture, we would generally be talking about a kind of country cousin of British culture or European culture, kind of a cheap rural knockoff. That's how many people in Europe saw American culture in the 19th century, and there were many Americans who saw American culture this way. And for example, the author of Last of the Mohicans, James Fenimore Cooper, he had read a novel from Britain, a British author, and he thought, well, I can do better than this. And it was revolutionary that he wrote a novel, right? The Last of the Mohicans. So in this period, in the 1920s, the United States develops its own cultural identity. It veers away from European culture significantly, and it changes the American psyche. It creates a different mentality amongst Americans relative to Europeans, and it's very intense, and it lasts to this day. For example, if you were to take, a good kind of joke about this is, Hank Hill from the show King of the Hill. You take him to a European art gallery of modern art. He doesn't like it. He can't make any sense of it. Well, of course not. His cultural experience is totally different. His cultural experience is one of relative prosperity, of hard work paying off, of growth, etc. And this is because the U.S. economy, it's in part because the U.S. economy grew by leaps and bounds. The automobile industry began to develop, radio began to develop, switched from coal to the development of hydro-based electricity, and finally we have a new art style. At first it's a style of poetry, it's called jazz, and then it will become a style of music. A demonstration of this different mentality lies in the contrast of these two poems. I have listed in the description box at the very end. One is called Dreamers by Siegfried Sassoon, and another poem is called Dreams by Langston Hughes. One is a British poet, one is an American poet. One is coming from an experience of traumatic warfare. The other is an African American poet who is experiencing, is part of a movement called the Harlem Renaissance, which isn't just confined to Harlem. It's a movement kind of encapsulating thousands of African Americans who had moved out of states like Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and had moved to northern cities to find employment in industrial, in the growing factories of these cities, and having free expression, free from the confines of the Jim Crow oppressive laws. There's this flowering of literature, a flowering of poetry, a flowering of music, a flowering of all sorts of different cultural activities, and this would be, even though it grew out of this experience in these cities, it would inform the larger American culture and the larger American culture would become ultimately inseparable from it in the 1920s and 30s. And I would like for you to just contrast the kind of the negativity, the fatalism, the despair in the Siegfried Sassoon poem with the optimism in Langston Hughes' poem. And that's it, and we'll close with that.